Catherine sat down in front of a camera recently and did the one thing the palace almost never permits. She had a script. The communications team had prepared it the way they prepare everything, run through enough advisors that every sentence had been filed smooth at the edges. She read it over. She looked at it for a while. Then she turned it face down on the table and spoke about her youngest son in her own words, without notes, without clearance, and without telling anyone in advance she was going to do it. And she cried while she spoke, not at the beginning, about 2/3 of the way through on a sentence about Louis, and she kept talking through it rather than stopping, which is somehow harder to watch than if she had broken down completely. Kensington does not do unscripted. Kensington does not do tears. Everything that reaches you about those 3 children has been arranged, cleared, and timed. That is not cynicism. That is the actual policy deliberately held for over 10 years. The question that matters here is not what Catherine said. The question is what drove a woman that disciplined to say anything at all, because something had been going on inside that family for months, and the country had felt the outline of it without understanding what it was. Engagements rearranged with no explanation. Schedules shifting at short notice. A boy who was simply not appearing anywhere, with no reason offered, no reason promised, and a press office answering every question about the youngest Wales child with the same 4 polite words about family privacy. That silence was not accidental. William built it. He defended it for years against people inside his own household who kept warning him it would backfire. And then it backfired in the one way nobody in that building had anticipated. I will get to exactly how, because it is not what you are expecting. If you are new here, subscribe before we go further. This story is still moving, and there is more coming. I am Harold. I go through everything that moves around this family. The filings, the official records, the stories that got buried before anyone finished asking the questions. What follows is me putting the pieces together the way I read them. Stay to the end, because the last part of this story lands on a conversation between a father and an 8-year-old boy sitting on a floor. And if I give it to you now, it is just a man and a child sitting down, and you will not understand why it turned a future king inside out. Everything between here and there is the reason it lands. Start with the policy, because the policy is real and older than most people realize. George was born in 2013. Within about a year of that, William and Catherine settled on an approach to their children that has not shifted since. A decade of deliberate decisions about where those kids appear, how often, at what age, and in whose company. You have lived with the results of it your whole life without necessarily registering them. 3 children who appear perhaps a handful of times a year. Christmas at Sandringham, a balcony, a carefully chosen sporting event, photographs released by their own mother on her own camera on her own timing. Because a photograph you release yourself is one nobody can sell, that is the machine William constructed. He built it for a reason that has nothing to do with modern communication strategy and everything to do with a Saturday in September 1997. He was 15. He walked behind his mother's coffin through London in a dark suit while the entire world watched. And within a fortnight, every private thing Diana had ever owned had become public property. Her letters, her handwriting, her clothes sold and put on display, her voice on recordings she never intended anyone to hear. William learned at 15 exactly what this country does with a royal life once it gets hold of the details. He has spent nearly 30 years since making sure it never gets hold of his children's. Every closed door in this story starts there. Hold on to that, because by the end of this it turns all the way around on him. The last several months are where the policy stopped working, and the timeline is worth setting out properly. Louis is 8. He is the youngest of the 3, which in that family means fewer immediate expectations and more protection, and both of those things have been true his whole life. George is 13, with a future everyone can describe. Charlotte is 11 with a public presence she has been growing into since she could walk. Louis has been the one they kept back. For a long stretch this year, he was kept back entirely. Appearances that had been penciled in came off the schedule. 2 family events he had attended in previous years went ahead without him. The pattern was consistent enough that people who follow this family closely began counting the months. And the counting produced exactly the kind of speculation the policy exists to prevent, which is the first irony in a story that ends up full of them. I want to be fair to the policy before we watch it fail, because it worked for a decade and almost nobody acknowledges that. Those 3 children have grown up with something no royal child before them had. George turned 9 in public about 4 times. Charlotte has never had a school photograph sold to a newspaper. Nobody has a long lens image of any of them crying or falling, or having the kind of afternoon every child has and no child should see printed. Compare that to what William and Harry were by the age of 8, which was a running feature in the national press with photographers stationed outside the school gates. William built that deliberately against considerable pressure. It is probably the single most effective thing he has done in his working life. Hold that in your head, because the reason this story hurts is that the thing which failed was not a mistake. It was his best work. The turning point came at Windsor during a private rehearsal. It is the moment Catherine later described as the point where she could no longer hold the line. The rehearsal was intended to be gentle, a practice run before a formal appearance in a room with no crowds, no cameras, no one outside the household present, so the boy could work out how to stand and where to walk without an audience learning anything about how it went. Halfway through the morning, Louis stopped and reached for his mother's hand and asked her whether he was allowed to be seen. Not whether he wanted to go, whether he was allowed. Catherine knelt beside him and took both his hands. She has since told at least 2 people that she could not find a single sentence to say back to him that was both true and reassuring at the same time. William cleared the room of everyone except the staff who had to be there. He had George and Charlotte taken to another part of the residence because he did not want either of them to see their brother asking that question. That morning changed the temperature inside that household completely. Everything that follows is people reacting to it. William's response was to shut everything down. He suspended every engagement involving Louis with immediate effect and made clear he was not interested in discussing it. One missed ceremony, he said, meant nothing against a child who had started to believe there was a reason he was being kept away. It is hard to argue with the instinct. It is also the moment the whole thing began to come apart, and the people who tried to say so were the ones nobody in that family ever listens to. Senior aides warned that repeated absences would attract questions. The word deserves explaining, because it does real work in that building. An engagement in royal terms is an official duty or public appearance carried out on behalf of the monarchy, and the entire visible life of that institution is constructed from them. They are scheduled months ahead, logged, published. When a member of that family stops appearing at them, the absence is a matter of record rather than gossip. You do not need a source inside the palace to notice it. You need a diary. The advisors wanted a controlled explanation released before speculation filled the gap. Something short, something vague, something that let the press office answer questions with a document rather than a shrug. And the aides were not being cynical, which is the part people get wrong about that job. Their entire function is to look 18 months ahead and work out which silence is going to become a story. They had seen this exact shape before with Catherine herself in 2024, when a gap in the public schedule and a refusal to explain it produced months of speculation that went to places nobody could have predicted and did real damage to a real person before the palace finally said what was happening. They were not asking William to expose his son. They were telling him that an unexplained absence does not stay empty, and that somebody always fills it, and that he would not get to choose who. William refused, flatly, repeatedly, and for months. He would not allow his son's situation to become a public narrative while the child was still frightened and uncertain. He had 30 years of personal evidence for why that mattered. He was right about the danger and wrong about the solution. And the gap between those two things is this entire story. Because the silence did not stay contained around Louis, it moved through that house and got into the other two children, and neither parent saw it happening until it was well established. George is 13, which is old enough to understand something is wrong, and young enough to feel that absorbing it is his job. He decided calmness was expected of him. He got quieter, more careful, more useful around the house. Both parents read that as him coping well, because from the outside, that is what it looks like. Then one night, he asked his father whether a younger brother could be kept out of everything without anyone outside the family knowing. Sit with that question for a moment, because it is not about protocol. He was asking whether the silence meant something bad. He was 13, working out on his own that his family had stopped explaining things, and trying to establish whether the not explaining was the ordinary kind or the frightening kind. Charlotte is 11, and she went the other way entirely. She noticed every closed door, every conversation that changed direction when she walked into a room, every lowered voice, every adult who suddenly had somewhere else to be. Nobody sat her down and told her anything. She assembled a fairly accurate picture anyway, because 11-year-olds always do, and adults never believe it. And she did something with it that I keep returning to. She started leaving handwritten jokes beside her brother's bed, not once, but regularly, as a system. She had worked out on her own that when Louis laughed, he came back for a minute, and she went about producing that on purpose, in pencil, without telling anyone she was doing it. Later, when she overheard staff discussing the attention the family was starting to attract, she found her mother and asked whether strangers were worried about her brother. Then she asked whether Louis was going to have to answer them all. An 11-year-old should not be running that calculation. She ran it anyway because nobody had given her anything else to work with. I'm going to hold the most important scene in this story for a while yet. It happens between William and his son on a floor. And if I give it to you now, it is just a man and a boy sitting down, and you will not understand why it turned a future king inside out. It is coming. Everything between here and there is the reason it lands. Catherine was carrying something different from either of her children, and she was carrying it alone, sitting with Charlotte, explaining that things sometimes move slowly, while getting almost no sleep herself, keeping her worst thoughts away from William to protect him. He was doing exactly the same thing back at her, for exactly the same reason. Neither of them had noticed they had both stopped saying anything real. That is what prolonged strain does to two people who love each other and are both trying to be the steady one. Nothing breaks visibly. There is no argument, no coldness, nothing you could point at. The kindness just goes quiet and stays quiet. After a few months, you are two people running parallel operations in the same house, and Louis was in the middle of it, 8 years old, too young to understand anything about how that institution works, and old enough to read a room full of adults perfectly. He has always been the one who fills a quiet room. Anyone who has watched this family in public for the past 6 years knows exactly who he is. The child who cannot sit still through a ceremony, the one whose face ends up on front pages doing something his grandmother would have raised an eyebrow at. Questions, noise, sudden energy, an ongoing negotiation with his mother about whether he has to stand up now. Being the youngest of 3 in that family means fewer expectations. It also means you are the least explained person in the building. George's future gets discussed. Charlotte's role gets discussed. Louis has been allowed to just be a child, which is the kindest thing they could have done for him, and which left him with no framework at all for understanding why he had suddenly stopped going anywhere. The house grew quieter around him. That is the part he actually noticed. Not a decision, not a conversation, just adults adjusting their volume. All of that leads to the night this broke open. It broke open between the two of them after the children had gone to bed. Catherine had written her own statement by hand over several sittings, and she placed those pages on the table in front of her husband. The palace draft sat beside them. A palace-approved statement is wording cleared by royal advisors before public release, its purpose being to say something without generating anything new for anyone to ask about. It is genuinely skilled work. Every clause has been checked against what it might mean in 6 months. To Catherine, those sentences were empty. They described a situation without admitting there had been any fear in it. They mentioned progress without saying a word about what the family had actually lived through. They were, in the precise sense, unfalsifiable, and that was what she could not accept about them. William read the opening line of her version and shook his head before reaching the second. He told her that one public message can be replayed, analyzed, and quoted back at that boy for the rest of his life. He asked whether she was ready to watch their son discussed by people who had never met him and never would. His voice went up and then stopped mid-sentence because both of them understood at the same moment that the anger was fear in a different coat. Catherine did not back off. What she said next is the reason this video exists. She told him Louis had started to believe he was being kept out of sight because the family was ashamed of him. Read that again. Not because he was unwell, not because anything was wrong with him, but because he had worked out at 8 years old that he was the one who did not get to go, that nobody would tell him why, that when he came into a room, the conversation changed. A child given no explanation will build one, and the one he built was that he was the problem. That is what a decade of careful protection had produced inside the head of the person it was designed to protect. She pushed the official draft across the table and told William there was nothing in it that resembled the boy they had nearly watched stop believing in himself. She pointed out that George and Charlotte had both learned to lower their voices whenever their brother came up, that their eldest was watching every closed door in the building, that their daughter was leaving jokes on a bed because she had figured out on her own that laughter brought her brother back. The silence had stopped protecting one child. It was shaping all three, and then she told him the thing that finished the argument, because it did not come from her at all. Louis had made a request of his own, unprompted after thinking about it. He wanted to thank the people who had made him feel safe. He wanted George and Charlotte to know that what they had done had mattered, and more than either of those things, he did not want people thinking he had disappeared because he was not brave enough. William sat down. He put his hands over his face for a moment. Then he said something remarkable coming from a man raised from birth to keep his composure in public. He admitted that his decisions had not only been about privacy, they had been driven by his own fear of losing control over what happens to the people he loves. That is the most honest sentence anyone in that family has produced in years. It explains everything he has done since 1997 in a single line. They reached an agreement that night. Catherine could speak, she would keep the private details private, and she would stop pretending the last several months had been easy. One authority could still stop it, and he is the one person in that family who has been in exactly this position himself. Charles received the draft after an evening briefing. The first thing he did was clear the room. He read the pages twice. When he reached the line about a child mistaking privacy for shame, he took his glasses off and set them on the desk and did not pick them up for a while. Understand why that particular line landed on that particular man. Charles has spent his entire life inside an institution that teaches restraint before anyone is old enough to understand what restraint costs. He was taught it. He taught it to his own sons. One of them has spent 20 years telling anyone who will listen how much damage it did. And since February 2024, when Buckingham Palace confirmed his cancer diagnosis, Charles has been working out in public exactly how much of his own situation the country is entitled to know. He was not reading that sentence as a grandfather. He was reading it as someone who has been the subject of the same argument. William arrived shortly afterward, and Charles asked him one question: whether the statement actually served Louis, or whether it just made the adults around him feel better. That is a brutal question. It is also the correct one. Every family in this situation tells itself it is protecting the child. A fair proportion of the time it is protecting itself from having to say difficult things out loud, and the child absorbs the difference immediately. William defended his wife's judgment. He also admitted what he had been holding since the first conversation. The moment a recording exists, the family stops controlling the story. Reporters would go back through the absences. They would question the decisions. They would go looking for everything the family had deliberately omitted, and they would find some of it. He was right about that. All of it happened. The communications team had prepared a safer version by that point. This is the detail that settled everything. Their version was shorter, calmer, and it had removed the part where Louis thanks the people who helped him. They had taken out the only line in the entire document that belonged to the child. Charles rejected it. His reasoning, according to someone who witnessed the exchange, was that a statement stripped of the boy's own meaning would protect the institution while failing the person standing at its center, and that this was the exact trade the monarchy had spent a century making badly. He approved Catherine's version on one condition, and the condition is the thing I would put on a front page. Louis had to hear every word before it was released. Not a summary, not the broad idea. The whole thing, read to him, so he understood precisely what the country was about to be told about him and had the chance to say no. Think about how rare that is. An 8-year-old given an actual veto over a royal statement about his own life by the king in writing. Catherine read him the final version privately. He listened with a seriousness she had not seen from him before. When she finished, he corrected one phrase. She had written that he was doing better. He did not want that. He told her he wanted people to know he was getting strong again. She changed it on the spot. Sit with the difference between those two things, because an 8-year-old found it and a room full of professional communicators did not. Doing better is something that happens to you. Getting strong again is something you are doing. One describes a patient. The other describes a person with a job to do and every intention of finishing it. He heard the passive voice and rejected it without any of the vocabulary anyone would use to explain why. Charles approved the revised wording with a note in his own handwriting. It said that truth delivered with restraint could protect the crown more honestly than silence. That note is the closest thing this story has to a hinge, because it reverses something that institution has believed since before any of these people were born. The default has always been that saying nothing is the safe option. Charles put in writing, in his own hand, that in this case, the safe option was the dangerous one. The recording went out. Catherine spoke calmly, thanked the people who had looked after her son, and said his strength was returning. 2/3 of the way through, she cried, and the palace did not cut it. The response was immediate and considerably larger than anyone had prepared for. Phones started going, headlines within the hour, messages arriving faster than anyone could process them, and then the coverage turned in the exact direction William had spent months warning it would. Broadcasters began building timelines. Someone in a graphics department pulled every appearance Louis had made in the previous 18 months and laid them out against the dates he had missed. By the second evening, that chart was on 3 different channels. Old family footage went up beside the new statement. Then one commentator did the thing that ended it for William. He was reviewing footage taken well before any of this started. Ordinary footage of a family walking somewhere. He paused on the boy's face and began going through the child's expression on air, frame by frame, telling an audience what a 7-year-old had or had not been feeling on an afternoon 2 summers ago. William was watching. He got up out of his chair, put his hand toward the screen as though he could stop the man physically, then found the remote and turned the television off mid-sentence. And he said one thing to the people in the room, and everyone present has repeated it since. My son is not entertainment. 5 words from a man who had spent his entire adult life refusing to say anything publicly about his children. Not a statement, not a line cleared by anyone. A father in his own sitting room, with his hand still half raised toward a television, telling a room of staff exactly what he thought of what he had just watched. Hold that image, because it is the whole argument in one frame. A man who spent 30 years building a wall around his children, watching a stranger freeze frame his 8-year-old's face and narrate it to the nation. Everything he had been afraid of, on his own screen, 4 days after he agreed to let his wife speak. He had been right about what would happen. He was just wrong about what the alternative was costing, but something else was happening outside the gates that week. And it is the reason this story reached people with no particular interest in this family at all. Families started leaving handwritten blue stars outside Windsor Castle, paper, cardboard, whatever was available, each one carrying the same 3 words the boy had chosen for himself. Getting strong again. They multiplied along the public barrier over 4 days, and most of them were not addressed to Louise. Most were addressed to someone else. A child in a hospital in Leeds, a grandson recovering from something, a daughter who had been having a difficult year, written by people who had come to Windsor to leave a message for a prince and ended up leaving one for their own. That castle has seen celebrations, mourning, and national uncertainty across centuries. And this country has a specific and complicated history with leaving things at royal gates, because the last time it happened on that scale was 1997, when the flowers went 10 feet deep outside Kensington, and the message underneath them was accusation. The nation stood at those gates and told that family it had got a child's grief wrong. 29 years later, the same country stood at a different gate and left paper stars for a boy it was worried about. Nobody planned the symmetry. William, of all people, would have noticed it. A newspaper ran Catherine's face across its front page under 3 words, "A Mother's Voice." Underneath, in smaller type, they repeated the phrase Louis had insisted on. That front page did something the palace could not have engineered. It did not present the boy as fragile, it presented what he was doing as courage. It put a mother's honesty above the institution's polish. On the same day, several other outlets were running frame-by-frame footage. Not everyone went that way, and the pushback was real. Commentators wanted the earlier absences explained. Some made the argument, not a stupid one, that a family funded by the public cannot unilaterally decide which parts of its working life are private. Palace officials answered harder than they usually answer anything. A child's situation, they said, is not public property. The family had said enough to acknowledge what had happened without surrendering every detail of it. When one phrase from the recording began generating serious speculation, the phrase about the moment they feared things were moving in the wrong direction, the advisors came back recommending a second clarification. Get ahead of it. Put out 3 more sentences and close the gap before it widens. Catherine refused. She said explaining every frightening detail would destroy exactly the privacy she had spent months protecting, and that she had not gone through all of this in order to end up doing at the finish what she had refused to do at the start. That is the moment she wins the argument she had been having with that building since the first draft landed. She had proved she was willing to speak. Now she proved she was willing to stop. Those 2 things together are what made the whole thing hold. The ledger is worth reading plainly. The family gave up something they had protected for over 10 years. That policy is now broken permanently. Everyone involved knows it. Once you have spoken about one of your children in your own voice, you have established that speaking is possible, and every future silence gets read against the one time you did not stay silent. William handed the press a precedent he spent a decade refusing to give them. Against that, they got one thing. An 8-year-old stopped believing he was something to be ashamed of. I have gone back and forth on whether that trade was worth it, and landed on yes. People I respect on this subject have landed the other way. The argument against is that the boy would have grown out of it, that children misread things constantly and recover, and that the family burned a decade of hard-won protection to solve a problem time would have solved anyway. It is not a stupid argument. It might even be right. The argument for it is what happened in a garden room a few days later, and once you have heard it, the ledger stops looking close. The real turning point never happened in front of a camera. It happened in a garden room on a floor, and nobody outside that house knew about it for weeks. A few days after the recording went out, William went looking for his son and found him sitting alone in the family's garden room. No doctors, no siblings, no staff, no protective adults arranging anything. A boy waiting in a quiet room. There was a chair right beside him. William ignored it and sat down on the floor, level with the child rather than above him. Then he asked one question. How did Louis feel now that people knew? Louis took a while to answer. What he said first had nothing to do with the statement or the public or any of the things his parents had spent months agonizing over. He said he had noticed that his father stopped talking about royal events whenever he came into the room. Follow what that means. Royal engagements used to sound exciting to him. He is 8, and the family business involves helicopters and crowds, and his father doing significant things in other cities. And he had grown up hearing about it constantly. Then over a period of months, all of that conversation vanished the moment he walked in. William had done that deliberately. He had removed every mention of duty from the boy's hearing, so Louis would not feel any pressure about when he might return. And Louis had drawn the only available conclusion, which was that everyone had decided he was never going to be strong enough to attend one again. That is what silence does. You cannot choose what it communicates. William removed the pressure, and the boy heard exclusion. And there was no version of that conversation the father could have controlled, because he never had it. Then Louis told him something William had not known. He said it the way children say the worst things, straight out with no runway in front of it. I heard you crying. 4 words on a floor in a garden room, from an 8-year-old to the future king of England. During the worst week, Louis had heard his father crying outside his bedroom door. He had been awake. He heard all of it. And he pretended to be asleep because at 8 years old he could not work out what he was supposed to do with a crying father. And pretending seemed kinder than letting the man know he had been heard. Take a moment with that, because there are 2 separate things in it, and both are devastating. The first is William, a man trained since infancy to hold his face still in front of the world, standing in a corridor in his own home in the middle of the night, unable to do it, believing he was alone. The second is the boy, 8 years old, lying in the dark, doing the arithmetic on whether letting his father know he had been overheard would make things better or worse for his father, and deciding it would make them worse. That is an act of care. He had been protecting the adult for months and had not told anyone. And the only reason it ever came out is that his father sat down on a floor and asked him a real question. That confession broke the restraint William had been carrying since the beginning. He pulled his son in and held on and told him that being brave has never meant not being frightened. It means saying the thing when staying quiet would be easier. That is word for word the argument his wife had been making to him for months, arriving from a completely different direction, out of the mouth of the person the whole argument had been about. Louis held on to him. Then he made a decision of his own. He wanted to return gradually. No ceremony, nothing formal, nothing with a schedule and a route and a rehearsal. A small thing where George and Charlotte could stay beside him. Catherine came in after it had finished. She saw her husband's face, then looked at her son, and understood without being told that something in that house had shifted permanently. The 2 of them agreed on the spot. No statement, no arranged appearance, no pressure of any kind, until the boy said he was ready himself. He said it in the summer. On the 1st of August, 2026, William and Catherine took all 3 children to the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. That is not a dramatized scene. It happened, and most of you will have seen the photographs. They went as a family rather than as a delivery of royals. In Scotland, William and Catherine carry the titles Duke and Duchess of Rothesay, and there was none of the ceremony that usually attaches to that. They watched the netball semifinal at the Hydro, England against Jamaica. England lost. They went to the Sir Chris Hoy Velodrome for the cycling. Louis wore a Welsh cycling bucket hat that was slightly too big for him and spent a considerable portion of the afternoon under it. At some point, he fist-bumped Finn, the game's mascot. That photograph went around the world inside about 2 hours. Nothing about that day was staged, which is the point of it. Nobody announced in advance that the children were coming. There was no statement attached, no explanation, no reference to any of the previous months from anyone in that family or that press office. They turned up at a sporting event with 3 children and sat in the stands like several thousand other people in the building. And the country worked out what it was looking at on its own. George is 13, Charlotte is 11, Louis is 8. Before they went in, Louis stopped. Charlotte took one of his hands. George took the other. Neither parent said anything. Catherine, in particular, did not urge him forward or try to cover the pause. She waited until he picked the moment himself. Then the 3 of them went in together. William watched that and understood something that had taken him the better part of a year to arrive at. Getting back to normal was never going to mean rebuilding the arrangement that existed before. It meant building a different one. He had spent his whole adult life measuring privacy by how much the family withheld, because that is the lesson he took from 1997. It is not a stupid lesson. He accepted eventually that silence can keep a child physically safe and leave him entirely alone inside it at the same time. Both things can be true. For a while, both were. Catherine had learned the reverse. Honesty could free her son from the belief that he was something to be ashamed of, and it could not become a license to hand over every private detail of his life. She had used a recorded personal statement rather than a press release specifically because that format let her tell the truth and stop. The stopping mattered as much as the telling. Charles said something privately afterward that I think will end up being the most quoted thing to come out of all of this, if it ever gets properly confirmed. He said the monarchy had not been weakened by any of it. He thought it came out stronger for having gone through something hard without turning the difficult part into a performance. That institution has run on restraint for a very long time, and restraint has cost people. This year suggested that dignity and emotional honesty are not in competition. The House of Windsor has spent a century assuming they were. Louis finished at the velodrome and came back to his parents. He did not ask whether he would be allowed to go to another event. He asked when he could come back. That question is the whole ending. Not the statement, not the front page, not the stars. A boy assuming without checking that there would be a next time. Catherine was sent a photograph of the display outside Windsor and went through it and pressed her fingers against one message written by another child. She asked quietly that the whole thing be preserved for Louis rather than cleared away. William read a letter from a father who had gone through his own version of this, trying to explain something difficult to children too young for the full answer and too old to be put off with nothing, and it landed on him that what his family had done had reached a long way past Windsor. Louis kept 1 star. It is beside his bed. The message on it says he was brave even when he was resting. The palace answered all of it with restraint, which was correct. No campaign, no commemorative photographs, no rushed return, no interviews, no follow-up statement, because none of what Catherine did was rebellion, and none of it was publicity. She corrected a message that fear had written, and she gave her son permission to think of himself as someone recovering rather than someone broken. That family spent the better part of a year believing love meant building walls high enough. They came out of it understanding that protection also means listening, admitting when you are frightened, and occasionally letting an 8-year-old tell you that you have got it wrong. The silence did its job for as long as it had a job to do. Then it needed to end. And only one person in that building was willing to say so. The people who fought her on it deserve the last word here because they have not had to answer for any of this. The advisors who wrote the clean draft. The ones who removed Louis's thanks from the statement because it complicated the messaging. The ones who came back afterward asking for a second clarification to close a gap that was never theirs to close. Every one of them was doing their job correctly. Every one of them would have handed that boy a document about his own life with his own words removed from it and gone home satisfied. They protect the institution. Someone in that building has to protect the 8-year-old. For months, the only person doing it was a mother with a pen and a piece of paper, writing without authorization. Thanks for watching. Hit like and subscribe, because there is more coming on this family before the month is out, and I will bring it to you.